Sure, yes. So I'm Sally. I'm currently working as Chief Education Officer at Advantage School. So I oversee kind of generally curriculum standards, but my background is a secondary English teacher. But since 2018, I've been working in this kind of cross-trust curriculum role. And our trust has primary schools and secondary schools within it. We've got 10 schools in our trust. So we're all through nursery all the way up to sixth form. And obviously my background is English, my specialism is English, but I also realised when I moved into that role, I needed to really work hard to understand English within a primary context so that I could support our primary schools. And Tricia was somebody that I was introduced to who was then really helpful, kind of bringing that primary expertise and helping me develop that, which was why it was so lovely to then work on the book with her and distill some of the thinking we had done together over a course of years.
Thanks so much, Sally. And Tricia?
Leading on from Sally, I think she's incredibly humble. When I first met Sally, she already knew an awful lot about leading English in primary schools. So as Sally said, we've worked together for about 6 years now, and I lead on curriculum and all aspects of professional development at a neighbouring trust to Sally's, and we have 38 primary schools in our trust, and any configuration of primary school, we've got it. We've got junior schools, we've got large schools that go from nursery up to year 6. We've got tiny village primaries. Our smallest one has the whole of Key Stage 2 in one class. So when people talk about mixed year groups, when they talk about that really thorny issue of, oh, we've got to do a cross phase because of numbers, because we're in a really rural setting, we've tackled all of those sorts of things. So I've been in teaching for 20 years. It wasn't my first career. When I first graduated, I went into publishing. I was an editor. I ended up leading book publishing for the Times Educational Supplements. And it was when I had my children and I was spending a lot of time in schools. And I thought, actually, you know what, this is where the impact is. This is where I want to be. So yeah, for the last 20 years, just having a great time in schools, really seeing the difference that we can make to the life choices of children, because that's something that we really emphasize in our trust. It's not about chances, we don't leave anything to chance, and it's about educating children so that then they've got those choices to decide what they do next.
This is really personal for me at the moment, Tricia, as well, because my daughter Billy's just started in reception, and last week she wrote her first sentence. She came home, and she
Wow.
In nursery they did some phonics, and she was sort of saying some sounds when she came home, and I said to her, oh Billy, if you're enjoying this, then I could teach you some phonics. You know, I know about phonics. I was a teacher, so I can do some phonics. And she said, no thank you, Daddy. And I said, well, if we look at this word, for example, like this word, what this first sound is, and she just looked at me and she said, I said no thank you, Daddy. And that was the end of preschool reading. But since she's gone in, I mean, it's been 6 weeks, and it is just incredible the pace that she has both started reading, like her blending has just like flipped like that, and she's also written her first sentence. And so I think you're absolutely right, Tricia. This is just the greatest gift that we can possibly give to a child, the ability to read and write. And this book, I think, helps subject leaders to get there. We're going to go in with our first question. So we're going to, the way that we're going to structure this, folks, is we're going to have about 5 questions based on some of the content from the book that really sort of like piqued my interest, especially, and then we'll throw it open to questions to folks that are on the call, where you can use our experts here to ask your questions. And if it's okay, Tricia, I'll start with you, because the book here, people can see the chapters, and it's a huge range of topics. And I think that gets to the point that we talk about English like it's one subject. And I know that Sally, you said, you know, you're an English teacher at secondary, and we sort of split up into English literature and English language. But at primary, we're talking about all these things that you sort of have chapters on, like oracy, speaking, listening, spelling, phonics, early reading, writing fiction, writing non-fiction. And I loved the way that you sort of set this out in the book. You call it a complex domain, which is a really nice way of kind of getting to it, I think. But also, perhaps controversially, sort of talk about how English is not just like a set of skills that we can sort of like flick through with children in a way that I think sometimes it's been characterized before. We just need to sort of like give kids these inference skills, and then they'll have then they'll be inferers, and you kind of bust some of those myths in the book. Could you just talk a little bit more about that, especially on the kind of what you mean by it being a complex domain, and what you mean by this idea that it's not just this set of functional skills?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing is, when something is absolutely vast, we want to break it down into bite-sized chunks, and we want to put it into neat little pockets and say, right, I've done that bit, tick, I've done that bit, tick. And then it can very quickly lead to, okay, when the GPS test was first brought in, we're just going to have discrete lessons learning about those particular elements, and almost sort of like teaching children tricks as well. And it becomes very isolated, and then we can be improving a single piece of writing, but not improving the child as a writer. Or we can be saying, okay, we know we've got a problem with handwriting. We're just going to introduce this handwriting scheme, and Bob's your uncle, it's all going to be so much better. And it can end up being a little bit procedural. And we had for a long time, and I remember doing it, you know, having these intervention groups, you know, oh, this child, you know, we've done this reading test, and before you even mark it, you knew that you were going to have a problem with inference questions. That was always going to be what came up. So you'd set up this inference group, and they'd go along, and you would ask some questions about a particular sport, say football, for example, and some of them would be able to answer them really easily because they knew a lot about football, and others, they would just not really know much about football, so they just weren't getting it. So you say, okay, we need to practice a little bit more of the strategies of inference. So the next week you might think, well, we're going to teach them something on rugby and practice our inference skills there. And, you know, a few more would be starting to get a little bit better, and thinking, oh, fantastic, this is working. We've got transferable inference skills. But no, what was happening was that they were like remembering from last week the basic rules of the game, and starting to think, well, I'm going to make some best bets, some good guesses that this is likely to be what I'm being asked this time round. So we were starting to sort of like think that we could teach inference skills, but actually it was more about vocabulary and background knowledge. And so within that complex domain, we've got to be zooming in and out all the time. And rather than trying to break things down into these little small pockets, small chunks of information, we've got to be thinking about how things are connected. And thinking about what we now know about cognitive psychology, we know that our working memory is severely limited, and with English we can become cognitively overloaded really quickly. So we can start to think about what we can automatize, and we can automatize handwriting, we can automatize spelling, but things like composition we can't automatize, and that's hugely complex. So it's then that balancing act between some things we are practicing discreetly because we know it's important to automatize so that we can free up the working memory for the more complex things. But then at the same time, balancing up that we don't lose that love and pleasure within our English lessons, because if everything becomes formulaic, then we don't have that joy. So balancing up learning to read using decodable text with having that really important ring-fence story time where children are introduced to a wide range of literature and stories which they wouldn't ordinarily pick up at home, because we want to introduce them to these authors that they wouldn't experience if they weren't in school. So that's why it's so complex, because there are so many things that we're juggling at the same time.
That's just so beautifully put, and I think it was making me think when I was teaching English, and that kind of false hope that you could, you know, if I could just give them, if I could just give them this sort of like skill, then they'll have that, and then it'll unlock something else, and especially on GPS, especially of sort of looking at a piece of writing and thinking, I know that you mentioned the teacher assessment framework in that chapter, and thinking, right, what's missing from the TAF, and we just sort of shoehorn that in sort of however, without really getting the child to think about why they're using that particular device or feature. Sallie, you'd like to come in?
I think as well, sort of coming at it as well, then me originally being secondary trained, you know, when you're teaching in secondary and you ask children to write, you get some quite odd distortions in their writing. And sort of as you are more experienced, you realise it's because these children think that good writing is ticking the things that they've internalised from the TAF. And I think that where Tricia and I are very aligned is like not getting polarized in terms of is teaching English about being very technical and building those technical competencies, or is it all about helping children be creative and love reading and writing? Like, we're very much like, and this isn't us sitting on the fence or trying to avoid a controversial response. We really feel it, that those technical competencies will underpin children's enjoyment and love of English as a subject. And sometimes actually, yeah, just reading and talking about how much we love this story or what we think of this character is enough, but we do also need to make sure that children have those foundations really secure as well.
Thank you. I mean, I would imagine it's the most complex cognitive, like it's the most complex cognitive thing that humans do. And I think about how Homo sapiens have been around for about 300,000 years, and for 99% of that, nobody wrote. And then for another 99% of that, very few people wrote. And this kind of like this idea that we are going to get we're going to give every single person this gift of being able to write is so new, really, only the last sort of century or so. And I think that you set out sort of like how we do that just so beautifully in that chapter. We're going to move on to the next question, and Sallie, if it's okay, I'll come to you. I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about a case study that you've included, which everybody always loves the case studies, seeing a concrete example of sort of how people are doing it. And you've chosen one of my favourite schools, Stanley Road in Oldham. Andrew Percival is the deputy head there, and I know has been sort of really writing widely about their approach to writing, and especially this idea of like the importance of the sentence, which sounds odd, but you picked this out, this idea of why the sentence as a unit of meaning is really important, and set out in this case study why it's so helpful. So could you share a little bit more about the case study that you've included and why you felt that this was important to emphasize?
Absolutely. So whenever I'm in schools, I'm spending most of my time talking to leaders, subject leaders, teachers about curriculum in all subject areas. And in English, and I think particularly with writing, some of the ideas, like talking about what are the components before the composite. So what are the units, like a sentence, that we need to be secure on to create a piece of extended writing? How do we sequence that kind of curriculum? Like what's the order that we're best to teach it in? And how do we really deliver a curriculum that's there to support pupils in attaining mastery? Like, what does that mean in English? It seems to me that English teachers generally can find this quite challenging, and I experienced it as an English teacher. Kind of, you've got this broad domain, you're really trying to get children to do something that's really complex. As you've said, it's hugely overloading in terms of their cognitive processing, and that actually makes it really hard to unpick as a teacher as well, and to think about, what do I want to teach, what order is it best to teach it in, and how do I check that they've got it before we move on? And that's why we have children all the way up to sitting their GCSEs who still don't use full stops and capital letters correctly, even though they've definitely been taught it throughout their time in school, but they just haven't secured it. So because that's so difficult, I felt that it would be really useful to have a case study that kind of delved into that components approach for English. And what I love about what they've done at Stanley Road, and I've been lucky enough to spend some time with Andrew Percival and really get to understand what they've done, and it's influenced our approach in our primary schools as well, is that they've really lent in, I think, to that complexity. They've they've thought about how we need to kind of position grammar in a meaningful way within the primary curriculum. So I think grammar gets a really bad reputation. You only have to, it's such a cliche, but I'm going to say it, like you say, fronted adverbial, and you can split a room quite quickly. And actually, but teaching those components are really important so that children can write, so that it's not necessarily important that we just teach those for the sake of teaching them. It's so that children can write effectively. And I think this curriculum really thinks through what are the units of grammar, particularly so that children can build sentences, but then obviously you're taking them beyond that so that they can manipulate syntax, they can manipulate their sentence structure, so that they can communicate clearly and increasingly effectively. And it's just the evidence base that sits beneath it, and what kind of you can see on the screen there is where we've broken down what happens in that curriculum, but also the bullet points. Why is that likely to be effective? Drawing on the evidence that we've summarised in the rest of the chapter. So, and I think that's really important, because you don't want to just be taking those kind of surface features. You need to understand, why is this likely to work for our pupils? Why is this likely to build their competence as writers? And they've just spent such careful thought mapping their way through it. And they've also thought about the optimal way then to teach it. And I know they go back to that as well. They've kind of thought about, it's very live. They see how it goes in the classroom, they review it, and they are constantly developing that approach. And I have to say, kind of, once I'd engaged with this curriculum, we had kind of a curriculum approach that was pretty granular, but we moved closer to this, and it really helped us develop our own thinking in our schools. And the other reason I wanted to include it is because, therefore, I've seen firsthand the phenomenal effect that this has on pupils. When you are just supporting them to feel very secure and to reach mastery, you're explicitly teaching them what they need to know, you're giving them loads of time to practice it, and then you're getting them to reach that mastery before you move on. And we have had some teachers, when we've kind of introduced this idea, say, oh, that sounds a bit like it's going to be quite dry. Dry is the word you hear. And actually, it's the pupils that convince the teachers, because you just say, just give it a go. And actually, they report back very quickly, oh my goodness, like these pupils who previously were really struggling are suddenly flying, and they're able to do it. And the children's self-esteem grows as a result of that as well, because they're seeing the success, they're seeing the progress they're making. They're not being told you're making good progress, they can see it in their own work. And that convinces the teachers as well. So for me, it felt like such a practical example of what we were trying to communicate about how curriculum works, but within English, that really exemplified that approach, but also is quite, it's actionable. Like they've shared so generously everything they've done. And, there's training that they've put out there for people that is available. So it's things that you can take away pretty quickly as well, and think about, how could we use ideas like this to develop our own writing curriculum.
And one of the things that's really come through from you hearing you explain that is the kind of equitability, the deep principle, like a real like commitment to like equitability for pupils, so that it's almost fail safe in terms of we think that there are, as you say, this kind of maybe it's a large number of sort of like components that make up sort of skilled writing, but the number is the number, and so first we'll need to name those, and then we need to make sure that they're in the right order, but then we're going to give every single child every single one of those tools, and that success, that must be hugely motivating for the children, knowing that you have that wide range of tools, so that when you're starting to think of writing your sentence, fronted adverbial is a really good example, because you're right, it gets a bad press, but we probably all sat there and marked a piece of kids' work where every sentence starts with the, and you're tearing your hair out thinking and then
yeah.
And so just having that broader set of even time, manner, place adverbs just means that the child then has choice. The child can make some writerly choices of like, how would I like to start this sentence? And I've got a range of ways that I can do that. Tricia.
And I think also it's because we're teaching it so explicitly, we're saying to the children, this is the way we speak, this is the way that we write. Because if we say the sentence aloud, children are going to be saying fragments, and it makes perfect sense to them. Whereas what we're doing is we're saying, this is how we write. So our non-present reader, somebody who you've never met potentially, can pick this up and understand what it is that you're saying, what you meant. And so this is why we need to have this particular element in our writing here, because it helps the reader, and we're making the implicit really, really explicit. And then that creates equity, because if you've got children who their spoken language is very similar to their written language, they've already got a head start. And then what happens to the children who have very different spoken language to written language?
That's a really good segue to our next section on spoken language, which is all about oracy. And you've got a whole chapter on oracy. I know lots of schools are thinking deeply about this, and lots of English leads, I'm sure, are thinking, well, this is kind of under my area of responsibility. We need to ensure that kids have an opportunity to think about oracy. And this is a book for subject leads. It's a book for English leads. And so one of the things that I think is so brilliant about this book is that you include these kind of example PD sessions. So you include sort of, if you as an English lead, you've read this chapter on oracy, you've got some of the big ideas and some thoughts, how might you then bring that to your teaching staff to improve oracy across the school? And you set out sort of broken right down to sort of like the timings for the session. And I think that some of the ideas in this PD session, well, I love this because it gives the way that you've framed it and what you've suggested of sort of taking examples of poetry from EYFS right through to year 6. It means every teacher can see the kind of progression. They see what kids are doing in other year groups, what they might have done before if you're a year 4 teacher, what they might have been reading and performing in year 2 and 3, and what they're going to go on to read and perform in year 5 and 6. And so this is just like such a lovely way of sort of organizing this. And I know you have one of these PD session examples for every single chapter, but let's just focus on this oracy example for a moment. And Tricia, would you mind sort of saying how you kind of structured this and put it together, and why you think this kind of approach to PD as an English lead might be effective?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So one of the starting points really was to, have an example sequence where we could really pull out the sort of like quite vague statements. So things like, learn and retell a short story. Well, that could be interpreted in a whole raft of different ways. So something that we've done in our trust with our oracy curriculum is we've really identified, well, the granular steps. What does this look like in a lower key stage 2 class? What does this look like in an upper key stage 2 class? And we've done it by phase because we recognize that learning happens over time. And just because after lots and lots of practice you can get up to a certain standard, that doesn't mean that then you retell another story and you're going to be able to retell it with the same level of proficiency. So recognizing that learning happens over time and we need lots of deliberate practice, but also recognizing that we can't learn every aspect of oracy at the same time and then keep on learning every aspect of oracy at the same time, which can be a danger in some approaches. So with this PD session, and what we really thought about was the importance of, getting people to understand the rationale together, meeting people where they're at. So as you identified, taking an example of poetry where everybody will have an example of children's work that they can bring to that PD session. And then really celebrating strengths, picking out things that are going well. So we start from a really positive point. We're not saying, right, this is rubbish, this is what we're going to do instead. So bringing people along on that journey is really, really key. But then within that, identifying the gaps, identifying where, oh, well, we do this in reception, and we're doing exactly the same thing in year 3 or 4 or whatever, it doesn't look any different. Where's that progression? So then with that clear structure from the example that we've given from our trust oracy curriculum, it then opens up that opportunity to have those professional dialogues, which they're developmental, they're not judgmental. And I think that's really, really key in bringing people along, so that then you feel that it's not being done to you. You know, you've got agency in this process. So it's this collective buy-in. And then that also then means that it gives the person who's leading that PD session the opportunity to identify, well, who's likely to be an early adopter? Who's somebody that I can bring in to work alongside me on this, to say, come and see what happened in my classroom, come and see the impact this has had. Because I think, you know, that's really key, isn't it? Any kind of implementation you do is, well, how does the theory translate into practice? So for us, when we were putting this together, it was really thinking very, very clearly about how you build that buy-in, build that agency, but you time it really carefully so that you're managing teachers' cognitive load as well, because we spend so much time thinking about children's cognitive load, but how much time do we think of doing the same thing within our PD sessions as well?
And throughout the book, it's really clearly pitched at English leads and thinking about how they can use this to lead their subject and to lead their and to support their teachers in their development, as you say. And this, go on, Tricia.
No, I was nodding.
And this was, I think this is such a good example, because I know that oracy is like quite hot right now and that people are thinking about it, but the way you explain it there, Tricia, I do think that, you know, when I was teaching year 4, for example, I'd you know, they would perform some poetry and I would say something like, loud and proud, guys, loud and proud. And that's basically what every teacher said from year 1 up to year 6. And so how are we actually supporting the children? What do we mean by more sophisticated or better performance in year 6? And you have to get into, as you say, the details of how you would kind of get to some of the ways to kind of like enunciate or the prosody as sort of like emphasis on particular words and matching the kind of like emotional sort of tone of the piece, and that would be a delightful session to be part of with your colleagues, to think about how you're gradually giving children that more granular kind of progression. Fantastic PD session. Thank you very much for sharing that. Like I said, one of those at the end of every chapter. So lots of great ideas to set you up for all of your PD sessions for the year and much more. So I'm going to come to you, Sallie, because like we know one of the big things that I think that people have sort of come to understand over the last couple of years is this idea of a knowing doing gap with kids, that just knowing that you need to put a full stop at the end of a sentence isn't enough to do it, and we see that all the time with our kids, unfortunately. But also true with teachers and subject leads as well, that just building a lot of theoretical knowledge is necessary but not sufficient. Implementation is absolutely key and much harder than I think most people imagine. And so you have a whole chapter on implementation. It's based on the fantastic EEF guidance on that, but you've contextualized every single item of that into English and thinking specifically about what this would mean for English. I just picked out one of the phases. You set out all 4 phases and contextualize all of those. But just one of the phases, the explore phase, the very first thing that an English lead might do when thinking about implementation. So could you just share a little bit about why this phase is so important and often missed, and how you might see an English lead just sort of beginning with some implementation thinking?
Can I jump in there? Because I think I was going to answer this question, Jon. Is that okay?
Apologies, yes.
Yeah. No problem at all. So I think looking at the EEF guidance and really thinking about that prepare phase is so key, because we can have a look at something and we can think, oh, I've just been popping in and out of classes, I've seen handwriting in books, it's presentation's not great, right, let's get a handwriting scheme, silver bullet, tick, job done. And actually it's that explore phase that we need to pull back to before we even get to prepare. It's, you know, well, okay, so we've been in there, we've seen that handwriting is not where we think it should be. We need to explore that further. You know, well, we've got some hunches. A hunch might be that there's not been enough time for handwriting practice, or another hunch might be that there's inconsistencies with expectations. Some teachers are more relaxed about it than others. We can have all sorts of hunches, but we need to go in and we need to explore further. We need to start, you know, digging deeper and start to triangulate. And then when we've got to that point where we think, yep, okay, so yep, we've really thought about this and we know that handwriting is definitely an issue. But what we've done is we've tracked back and we've realised that it's not the handwriting scheme, it's the fact that the adults aren't using the handwriting scheme. For example, we're starting to notice that some adults, when they're writing on the working wall in lessons, they're not modelling that script consistently. Other adults, they might be using a script that they had used previously. And so actually we've gone that bit further upstream to identify that we need to fix that before we then think about handwriting lessons with the children and so on. So that prepare phase is really, really key, really important. And then also just really thinking about how we share the rationale for why we've made the choices that we've made as well. Because if we don't share that rationale with colleagues, it's going to be much harder to get people on board with that phase of implementation. And so it's just really us taking those steps back and then thinking, well, before we introduce something new, let's do a slush audit. Let's look at what we're already doing and let's think, is there anything that we're doing that we don't need to be doing? Can we be freeing up some time? Because if we're asking our colleagues to, thinking about this handwriting example, if we're saying to some of our colleagues, right, your handwriting is really clear, really legible when you're writing on paper, but when you're writing on the working wall, it's not, or your handwriting is almost illegible, because we can have colleagues where it's almost illegible, or you're using a different handwriting style. We've all got to be together. We've all got to learn this new handwriting approach together. So if we're asking colleagues to spend the time learning to do something new, then we've got to think, how are we creating that time? How are we freeing it up? So that slush audit, looking at what we're currently doing and what we can perhaps stop doing, is a key part of that prepare phase. That explore phase, so that then when we get ready for the prepare phase, it's really starting to think about, well, while we were exploring, who looked like they were going to come on board with us quickly, who looked like this was somebody who was like had an appetite for this change, and working with those colleagues ahead of time, so that then when we start to build our implementation plan, we can then be thinking in that prepare phase about how we're going to be rolling things out. So when we first start doing this sort of work, we're really keen to get to the end point, and it's recognizing that actually the time that we spend on that explore and prepare phase is going to pay dividends when we come to the implementation phase a little bit later on.
And I imagine that's actually quite reassuring for subject leads, because I think you're right that there's that anxiety of I'm responsible for this. I've seen this problem. I need to fix it tomorrow. Like, what am I going to do tonight? What am I doing tomorrow morning to kind of fix this? And really what you're advocating here is this kind of professional curiosity, taking time to diagnose like the actual underlying causes of where there are issues, and then building consensus and a plan with folks around what a kind of a longer term iteration could be for addressing that. And so that whole chapter, that's just obviously one snippet, but stepping a subject lead through, because I know some of this is quite new, this idea around implementation and thinking about implementation. So walking through step by step each of those with English examples, I know will be tremendously helpful for folks. So thanks for including that. Sallie, it is you. And this final question, I get to visit a lot of schools for my current job now, which is really lucky. And this sounds quite deficit based, but I'm going to say my heart sinks in that sometimes I'll visit a school, and the children in their reading lessons, they have like a gobbet of text. They'll have sort of like 100 words or 200 words. It's a little chunk from a chapter, and I'll ask the kids if they've read the book, and they can't even tell me what book it's from. And it turns out that's their kind of reading diet, that each week or every 2 weeks they get another gobbet of text, a couple of 100 words from a book that they'll never read, and some comprehension questions at the end of it, and they kind of read the little gobbet of text together, and they answer the questions and then move on to the next one. And you have a whole chapter here on text selection, on the importance of full text of novels, of books, of children reading them, engaging with them, seeing how the plot arc develops over time, and how the character arcs develop over time, and the plots. And you have this fantastic example where, broken down year group by year group, where there could be a reading text, a poetry text, a writing stimulus text, and I just loved being able to sort of flick through this and sort of see the journey that the kids would go on. So would you mind just sharing a little bit about why you think it's kind of important to give children full text, and then some of the criteria, and earlier in the chapter you sort of go through these, some of the criteria that an English lead might use as they start to consider which text to include within their curriculum?
Yes, I could do my best to do that. So I think the fact that you're sad, you see that in lots of schools, and when you say that, it makes me sad too. That's the first reason, is because actually enjoyment is something we want to be promoting. Who doesn't love a good story? But if you're only getting extracts, you're not getting the whole story. So you're not getting that chance to engage with the story. And you mentioned earlier, like, reading and writing is fairly new to our species. Storytelling absolutely isn't. We know that every culture has an oral tradition that's incredibly rich. We are a storytelling species, and children need to hear lots of stories. And stories kind of now, we are, sorry, I'm just going to close that thing. You know, we're now where stories are written down. So we have this really rich heritage to share with children. So I think it's really important that, you know, if we're talking about what do we do to promote a love of reading, if our answer to that is focused on we dress up for World Book Day, or we dress up potatoes for World Book Day, or we have challenges for children to read so many words independently, and all of these things, which we do assemblies on how great reading is, that's all fine. But actually, if we're not giving children the opportunity in the classroom to experience amazing stories, then I think we're really missing a trick in terms of just giving them a love of literature. So we have to let them experience full text for that reason, but also for your outcomes too, because I'm sensing that the reason you would teach those isolated text extracts is because it's something that they're going to face in their SATs eventually. They're going to have an extract with some questions, but we're kind of then, by reverse engineering that and making that the curriculum, is not actually helping those children that much. Because if I read an extract, because I've got a really strong mental model of how stories work, how the narrative arc works, how characterization works, how foreshadowing works, and foregrounding and backgrounding of information, I've got all of that through exposure to loads of full texts. So I can tell whether, I think this feels like it's from the beginning, the middle and end, and I can make some better inferences and predictions as a result of that. If I've only ever seen extracts, how am I developing that schemata for what stories look like? So that's kind of two important reasons. So one is for enjoyment, two is to help your outcomes. So the sort of the rationale for the screen that you had up, do you want me to just kind of talk about some of the choices? And
that would be great, yeah,
because I think that probably then will help, because then you've got to think about, okay, so if we think it's really important to have full text, what do we want children to get out of it? So one of the things that we talk about in the chapter, or what progression looks like in English, and we've covered tonight in this webinar thinking about progression through different technical aspects of English, but also progression in literature is about reading about diverse truths. Literature is there to explore the human condition. So if you think about that as a strand that you would want to develop for children, if we look at what we've got on here, for example, books like Goodnight Mr. Tom, We've got no ballet shoes in Syria, and things like wonder. Like you can see there's a sense there that we're exploring different experiences, but also we're thinking about what does it feel like to be different, to be an outsider. And there's the kind of the windows and mirrors metaphor. You know, there won't be a child in our classroom that hasn't at times in some circumstances felt like an outsider, but also they're seeing another exploration of that feeling in a different context. So it's helping them relate to one another as humans, but also helping them understand themselves. And I think that's really important. Like, why do we have literature? Literature is there to explore those kind of big universal questions about the human condition, but through some specific scenarios. So that's one thing to think about kind of as a progression model, but also what are the sort of archetypes and conventions of literature that you want to expose children to, so that again, when they go off to secondary school, they've got some good mental models. So you can think about things like the hero narrative, and you've got things like The Hobbit that would help that. And then you've got some challenging ideas around things like a tragic hero in Macbeth, or perhaps some quite subversive elements of the hero in a text like The Hound of the Baskerville. So it gives you kind of a chance to explore those conventions. And I think kind of structurally, I've touched on kind of why extracts don't help children develop that sense of structure. I bet in most of the schools you go in, that there's a sense that we should be asking children to predict, but children can't effectively predict if they haven't got a sense of structure. Like, the reason we're asking them to predict is because we're asking them to pick up on the clues that writers put into a text. And if they never get to see that play out, they're not going to internalize the importance of how structure works. So they need to feel the narrative arcs, but also to think about then, once they've got that understanding, how can we introduce them to more complex texts in terms of narration? So you might have texts with a multiple narrative, like you have in Wonder, where you've got the story told from different points of view. You might have text with kind of non-linear time sequences with flashbacks, and then that will all develop pupils' understanding of actually what is important, and why do authors work in that way, that they might foreground some information for us and jump about. So what pupils need to have a good sense of plot to be able to then see when authors are manipulating our expectations, and then they can think about why are authors doing that. Obviously, cultural capital is an important thing to consider as well. So you know you've got some big hitters in there, as well as children's classics. And I would say you want to balance kind of stretch and challenge, with then perhaps a text afterwards that you might think of more of a children's classic or a modern classic, so that you've kind of got some challenge and enjoyment balanced out. And we didn't mention kind of poetry, and poetry is kind of a chance, actually, if you need to do a shorter text. Poetry, you can do a full poem and it not take a whole term. And I think that you can, you know, think about all of those conventions of literature, but you've also got conventions of poetry. Like if you think of the text here, you could see like in The Highwayman, what else have we got? Song of the Witches, The Night Mail, like a sense there of rhythm is very important in poetry, and we've got some really cracking examples there. It introduces pupils to more archaic language, which is the type of language they'll be reading more text within secondary school. And you've also got such a strong sense of like symbolism and metaphor used in poetry. It's such a distilled and condensed form of literature that it can be a really efficient way actually to help children start to grasp with sort of the craft of an author that will help them as well in their future studies. So I feel like that's a bit of a whiz through of lots of different strands being together. And I know that's quite overwhelming to think of all those things, but actually that's why we kind of gave this example in the book, sort of to follow on from outlining some of those things that would underpin your kind of progression model for reading, so that there is an example there that can help you kind of think about it and maybe think about your own curriculum, and how that's meeting the needs of the pupils to develop and progress as readers. And
I imagine that for lots of people that will be the first thing they flick to when they get a copy of this book, because it was definitely one of the first areas that I always want to have a peek at those progressions. And in opposite to my kind of sad feeling of these little gobbets of text, I look at that progression you set out and all of those texts, those as you say, classics and modern and diverse texts. And I just think, when I think of my kids, I think if they could leave year 6 with that inside their brains and souls, like what a huge gift to kind of have all of those given to them, and so a huge responsibility for an English lead to think
and it
about.
is brains and souls, isn't it? Like I really feel that like this is so important to being human, and it's sad if we don't give that to children. So I'll stop being impassioned now.
No, please do. Tricia,
I just wanted to come in and just really like stamp what Sally's talking through there is something we both passionately believe, which is that we need to have a reading canon in our schools. So the English lead is the custodian of the canon, and the canon, it's this bank of core texts which we've carefully mapped from early years through to year 6, so that we know that children are going to be introduced to a range of genres, and from different periods as well, different text types that they wouldn't ordinarily pick up. Because if we just have a spine and it's a bit of a pick and mix and teachers get to choose their favourite ones, we're not going to have that balanced landscape for children. And having that canon, as Sally just talked through, it just opens up this whole world that children aren't aware of, and then we don't know where it's going to take them and what they're going to end up reading in the future. So it really is, you know, life-changing in terms of opening those worlds for them.
Folks, we're out of time. And I probably should have known this was going to happen, because we've barely, that was 5 pages out of the book, and that I think is testament to just how rich this book is. If there's an area of English leadership in primary that you are thinking about, there is just, as you've seen there, abundant wisdom and good sense and actionable advice within the pages of this book. It really is an absolute treat. In the chat, you'll see that there is some information about how you can order the book and some discounts available if you would like to get bulk copies for if you're from a group of schools or a trust. So please do order the book and let your friends and colleagues know about it, because we truly believe that this is going to be helpful for English leads, and they have such an important job and this big responsibilities. They deserve all of the good guidance and support that they can get, and we're confident that this book can offer exactly that. Which just leads me to say a huge thank you. We could go through to 8 p.m, couldn't we? But we can't. But a huge thank you to Sally and Tricia for setting out a little bit of the sort of the rationale and the thinking that went into just a few of the pages of this book. Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Tricia. And thank you, everybody, for joining, whether you're here now or whether you are watching back later. And we hope that you enjoy the book.
Thanks.
Thanks
Thank
all.
you.
I'll stop
Bye-bye.
recording.